is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. The only time I've ever seen him wear green is in a pop color on an ascot, Stu Horvath.
Weirdly enough, I'm wearing green pants right now.
Really?
Yeah. They're like olive green jeans, you know?
You know, when I met you, you were nothing but black.
Well, yeah.
Now, you know, as you've gotten older, you have incorporated some colors into your life, like that snazzy Caldor shirt I know you just ordered from ADT's.
This is true. Also, I was going to say that I've moved into earth tones. I'm very earth tony in my middle age.
It's a very dad thing, I think, because my dad growing up, he was like all black all the time, Johnny Cash. Then one day he wore a blue, and we didn't know what to do in my household. So, Stu, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about Delta Green.
I am so excited to talk about Delta Green. You know, I've got friends who play it and swear by it. And it's one of those things that, as a player of Cthulhu and that style game for years now, I'm shocked that we never got around to playing it.
Okay, so this is going to be like a three-parter, and not all in a row like we did with Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World, because I don't think anybody really wants that much Call of Cthulhu in a row. That's like a month of episodes, but there is sort of like a lot to cover. And the funny thing about it is that I'm a recent convert to Delta Green. I thought that Delta Green was the dumbest idea when I first heard about it.
Really?
Yeah. My perspective was always that like horror is like the unknown and helplessness. So if you give people guns and you start giving them dynamite and like professional military training and throwing them at the Cthulhu mythos, like that demystifies it. But guess what, folks? I was wrong.
Whoa, you heard it here first, everybody. Dear listener, it's been known to happen, and it just did.
Yeah, I copped to it when I realized. The thing that kind of turned me off, it's an ironic thing. So back in 1993, I was like, I don't know, I was born in 78. So what was I?
Young. Young is what you were.
Yeah. I convinced my parents to take me to Necronomicon, which was this small Lovecraft-related convention in Danvers, Massachusetts that year. Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, and Gay and Wilson, the cartoonist, were the guests of honor. I have the program. They signed it both. It was very cool. I don't know why I was there. I was just kind of like enamored of Lovecraft's work and the Cthulhu mythos. I had been playing Call of Cthulhu, running it for a while, and I just kind of wanted more. Now, this was the pre-internet days when it was really hard to find stuff like that without going to a show like this. So I was on the lookout for like new, collections of stories, role-playing stuff, anything that I could get my hands on. I wound up spending a lot of time in the dealer room, and I met three people there that were fairly important. Mark Michaud is one of them. He ran Necronomicon Press, which was a chapbook publisher. They would print rare out-of-print Lovecraft stories, stuff from other authors in the Lovecraft circle, like Clark Ashton Smith. They would, Cryptblue was a zine that kind of put out for a while, and nice quality. Like they're less zines and more chapbooks, which is a sort of meaningless distinction in this era, because most of what we call zines in the 90s we would have called chapbooks.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is that they're not like photocopied like music zines, punk rock zines. These are a little bit more class. So he's an independent publisher making chapbooks. And then the Call of Cthulhu guys are there. So Greg Stafford's there, Keith Herber's there. I think Kevin A. Ross was in the group too. So I met all those guys, and like I got Keith Herbert to sign. I bought the Spawn of Azathoth box set. He signed it for me. My Brush with Greatness, Stafford and Herber in the same room. Snot-nosed kid. It's great. And then I also met John Tynes, who was the fellow behind Pagan Publishing, which I had also at that point had a couple issues of their fanzine, Unspeakable Oath, which was a Call of Cthulhu fanzine. Another independent publisher.
I see a running theme here.
Yeah. So meeting and talking to these three guys, like they were all very nice and very like patient the fact that like this goober was like grilling them. But I think talking to all three of them, I realized that they were independent, and like I realized what that meant until I talked to them. And they were all sort of different aspects of an independent sort of, indie small press experience, right? And I got very enamored of that. Only recently did I realize what a huge formative experience that was for me. Because like that's what I've done most of my professional life is independent small press publishing. And that was probably the first time I talked to people who were independent small press publishers. So it's weird to me that after a certain point, I really soured on Pagan Publishing's product. I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And especially from like the fact that these guys were totally independent. They were just doing their thing. But like something about it, like I bounced off it eventually. And I just thought like, it's making my eyes roll. And I don't know why. And I used to think this was so cool. Looking back, it's because it was the 90s and everything was getting edgier and edgier. And
it was getting edgier too.
Yeah. And I always had like different tolerances for that sort of stuff. And for whatever reason, I just sort of stopped being interested in the particular product that Pagan Publishing was putting out, which was Delta Green at a certain point. And that's sort of why I missed it. I kind of had my nose up in the air, and people I read about how great Delta Green is. And I was just like, yeah, but those guys are kind of like, doesn't he work for Wizards of the Coast or something? Meh. Stupid kid. You don't know nothing.
Hey man, you may have been a goober back then, but you were a goober who crossed state lines. So
this is true.
There you go.
I wish I was a goober who bought those books back then because they're very expensive now.
Yeah, that's what they call karma.
Yeah. So Delta Green it spins right out of an Unspeakable Oath issue that I already had when I was at Necronomicon. It's issue 7. So at the time, Tynes is working with this other scene called Interface, which is the same basic thing as Unspeakable Oath, except for cyberpunk. This is like the first Cyber Cthulhu crossover. And he puts together an adventure called Convergence, which is the first Delta Green adventure. And he's trying to combine sort of cyberpunk theming with the Call of Cthulhu horror experience. And then there's an issue of Interface, which does the same thing, but with a more heavily rooted in cyberpunk. So it's in 2020 and, the future back in 1992. And it's not really cyberpunk in what we expect. It has none of the trappings, but it has like a lot of the suspicion of power, the corruption of power, the hopelessness. So all of the thematic stuff, filtered through a Cthulhu mythos thing. And you're playing government agents.
Awesome.
Yeah. The first scenario is FBI team runs into the fungi from Yugath and hijinks ensue because they're not just the fungi from Yugath. They're the fungi from Yugath pretending to be gray aliens.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah. And this is the genius of Delta Green. And the first iteration of Delta Green is just source books for Call of Cthulhu. There's 4 of them, which is the original Delta Green, which comes out in 1997. A couple years later is Countdown, which I'll sort of get into what all of these contain. And then there's 2 more. There's Eyes Only, which comes out sort of a compilation of zines that they were putting out in the 90s. And then there's Targets of Opportunity, which is the same sort of thing that they find print after the turn of the millennium in really limited hardcovers that are quite nice. So the genius is that in Lovecraft's own story, Shadow over Innsmouth, the end of it, the main character goes to Innsmouth, finds the Deep Ones there, is horrified by this, and drops a dime to the feds. The feds raid Innsmouth. They go in force, they round up the town, they disappear the population, and they drop some depth charges off the coast. That's in the story. Chaosium in Escape from Innsmouth makes that into a campaign where you escape from Innsmouth and then you take part in the raid. It's a big kind of Call of Cthulhu mythos moment. That's the start of Delta Green, right? It makes sense because the government sees evidence of something unnatural that is a threat to their citizenry, right? They have to take this seriously. So Delta Green, is it Delta Green yet? It's born out of this operation in Massachusetts, kind of a psychological warfare outfit. That's sort of what it's branded for a while. It kind of kicks around until World War II, when it gets folded into the OSS and becomes like an actual like spy agency. And then there's ups and downs for the whole thing. It all goes haywire after a really bad op in Vietnam in 1969, and Delta Green gets disbanded. But the people who are in the know that they can't stop. You don't serve at the luxury of the president. You have to keep this unnatural threat contained, right? In more recent history than the 90s, they get reconstituted. And then you have like the guys who go back and like, okay, we're legit now. We have a budget. And then you have the cowboys who don't. But all of this lore is all sort of presented in these 4 source books. And you get a whole bunch of other stuff. There's other factions. So like there's a twisted history with Delta Green and Majestic 12, which is a real world covert agency program thing that a lot of conspiracy theories hone in on because it's UFO related. And, you get details on how that sort of folds into the Cthulhu mythos and such. And like all of these other things, there's like a criminal outfit in New York called The Fate, which is maybe Nyarlathotep's thing. There's other Deep One conspiracies. There's the Fungi from Yugoth are doing their thing. It's just laying out all of this lore. It's almost White Wolf-like, where like it's faction after faction after faction. You get their history, how they intertwine, what they're trying to do. And all of it is born out of this idea that once governments become aware of it, all governments become aware of it, and they are all competing. In World War II, there's a Nazi bureau, occult bureau, just like in Hellboy. Like, because it makes sense. Of course, like if there's actual occult power out there, people are going to try and tap it and going to do it at a high level in the government. Delta Green goes at it with the Karotekia, I believe is what they're called, the Nazis. And then there's, a Japanese version. There's a British version, like the Russia GRU has one, and becomes like this mix of spy thriller, occult stuff, Call of Cthulhu, cosmic horror. And as you get into the 90s, it's a little bit more like
X-Files.
It's like a mix of X-Files and like SEAL Team 6, like special ops. The genius thing is that it's still scary because the players don't have to pretend about not knowing what the Cthulhu mythos is. They get to know what they've read or think they know of Lovecraft's work because it's all canon, right? It's all part of the mythology, and it's all sort of
public domain, so you can write about it in your game. Yeah.
But it's the history of the game, right? Lovecraft stories aren't fiction in this world. They're historical documents of events that happened. So like your players get to know that there was a raid in Innsmouth, and that's how Delta Green was founded. And like when you're playing a 1920s campaign, you have to pretend that you don't know anything about anything, right? Like you're not allowed to make that leap like, oh, there's a cult. Well, they're probably worshiping Nyarlathotep because everybody in Call of Cthulhu worships Nyarlathotep. You don't have to do that. You can throw that out the window and say that like there is a baseline of Cthulhu mythos knowledge that we all know or think we know. And like the Keeper of Secrets will mess with you, but like you can talk about it. And I think that is actually super smart. When you're going into Call of Cthulhu, like you're sort of waiting for the thing. It's like watching the movie the second time so that you can see the thing that you think is cool. Whereas in Delta Green, you already know sort of the baseline stuff, so you don't actually know what's going to happen next.
For me, when you put it like that, it actually makes a lot of sense about Cthulhu and other games of that style, because as a player, whether you've read ahead in the book or not, you kind of know what is coming, and you have to play your character as if you don't. And that's kind of harder than it looks sometimes, because it is near impossible in many situations to not metagame and to not like try to think 3 or 4 steps ahead to keep your character alive, because you really do deep down know what is about to happen. However, in something like Delta Green, first and foremost, from all that descriptions and the descriptions that came from friends of mine who've been playing it, sign me the fudge up. And it's okay, folks. I said fudge, not the other word. So I'm into this idea. I am super into this idea because I also think you're right. When you know in game what you're up against, you don't have to pretend that you don't. And you can just let yourself go and immerse yourself a little more into it, because you really have no idea what is going to happen next. Even if you're walking around with an, M16 or whatever kind of gun in your hand and maybe a grenade.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter, right? Like it doesn't matter if you have an M16. Like that's not going to help you. The other beautiful thing about it is that Call of Cthulhu favors characters of a scholarly bent, and those characters are naturally cowards, right? They're not military guys. They don't want to get into physical confrontations. And they also realize the danger that the Mythos knowledge puts them in, and it's mortal danger, right?
Right.
FBI agents and army guys and jarheads and spec ops guys are incredibly ill-equipped for facing the Cthulhu mythos. These are organizations that are taught to fight, to put down their enemies. And that doesn't work with Call of Cthulhu. The Cthulhu mythos doesn't care. So that sort of is something that's brought out in the standalone game that comes later. We'll get into that in another episode, but the foundation is already there. These are people who are extra ill-equipped for dealing with the realities of the job, especially because so much of their job requires secrecy. So there's a lot of bad decision-making that is made to favor secrecy over the right thing to do. It causes a lot of problems.
Well, in a lot of spy shows that I would watch, or television shows that pertain to certain organizations that may have to keep secrets, it's hard because, you have state secrets, which are just like very big secrets that you can't even tell your family. Imagine that next layer of the onion, which is like, well, so we have our state secrets, but we also have these secrets about these things that your hair would turn white if you ever saw. And maybe you'd have to go spend some time talking to a special doctor about it afterwards. I don't know. Like, that is a whole nother layer to the stinky onion that is covert operations. That's crazy. And like for me, I know from chatting up friends of mine about it, in describing the way that I played Call of Cthulhu with you, I was essentially trying to play Delta Green.
Yeah.
In the way I was going in there, I was like, okay, we're going to blow this up. I got guns. We're going to take this monster out. Here's how we're going to do it. And there is a very stark contrast between the style of play and the characters in Cthulhu versus what you can do apparently in Delta Green. And I think that's pretty cool. I think there is that certain vibe that you don't often see done well in games where there is that other layer to it, which is bureaucracy. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. You need to explain what's going on to bureaucrats who don't believe you. And you have to come up with cover stories. And there's a lot of stuff that comes with this that I think is super interesting on top of the whole mind-blowing horror aspect of the game.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, man. I'm into it. So my burning question, of course, is what do they call the Keeper of Secrets?
Well, because these are just source books for Call of Cthulhu, you're still Keeper of Secrets.
Okay.
Yeah. But in the standalone game, I'll give you a spoiler, even though that's going to be a different episode. You're called Agents are the players and Handler is the GM.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is awesome. That is great. That is so good on so many levels.
So the cool thing about this is too that Delta Green was conceived in the early 90s as a framework for Tynes and his crew to play modern day Cthulhu in a way that made sense to them, that they could create their own scenarios and stuff. So, I mean, I think that's great to begin with. I think that it's just the next logical step for Call of Cthulhu is they make so many smart decisions, which I've sort of already talked about. But the other thing that is really special about this is that it really is a meta plot for Call of Cthulhu, a game that never really had a meta plot because your characters just get chewed up so fast. But it really is compelling reading. I've been reading the Handler book for the Arc Dream standalone game, and it's basically just a timeline of events. And I was so engrossed by it. It's so interesting. And now I'm getting into the Pagan Publishing source books, and they're so deep. And you can tell that this stuff all comes out of their campaign, and it's just sort of edited and adjusted to make sense. And it's just a huge dump of lore and stuff for you to use and mess with your players with. All of it is just this rich mass of messed up stuff, a messed up toolbox. It's like the guy from Saw's toolbox, it's just awful implements of things to throw at your players to confuse them, to mess with their preconceived notions about the Cthulhu mythos. And just it's so much fun. And at this point, there aren't any meta plots around in the modern. It's super elaborate and big and rich. And it's the last great meta plot. It's maybe the great meta plot because the problem with meta plot is that so often you're slaves to it. Whereas this is just raw material for your games. It doesn't matter what slice of horror you get. It's going to eat your characters alive. So the plot doesn't matter. It's just like giving you the catalyst for the terror, right? And it's just so good. It's so good. Like, I used to be like, why does everybody say that, like, this is one of the best role-playing game things ever? Like, it's just like army dudes versus Cthulhu. That's dumb. I was so wrong, so thoroughly wrong. This is one of the best role-playing like supplement series ever. And I was like so stupid about it. I'm kicking myself.
Well, Stu, I will be very honest with you. You sold me on it about 5 minutes ago. Knowing that we're going to do a couple more episodes on Delta Green, I think it's a good time to go home on this episode. Do you have any final thoughts on Delta Green?
Check it out if you haven't. Arc Dreams supplements for their standalone Delta Green game are fantastic. And that's next episode. And the episode after that is going to be about the fall of Delta Green, which is the 60s era one that moves the game to the Gumshoe system from Pelgrane Press and is set in the 60s and is also extremely good and like annoyingly well done. Like, all of this is just, there's like a level of quality. And it's just like, how was I so stupid to just ignore this stuff? Like, dive in if you're thinking about running it. At the very least, you'll have some entertaining reading. And at the best, you'll have scads of resources for your game.
Well, I know what I'm ordering from Noble Knight when I hang up this episode. And speaking of which, this has been another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I'm going to obviously post a lot of Delta Green stuff in the coming months.
You can follow me on the Twitter and on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I've been posting a little more on Instagram, not so much on Twitter, but I'm around. And if you want to chat, feel free to jump on the Vintage RPG Discord. We love chatting with people every day on our Discord. And if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, which I am so proud of you, buddy. You are just digging deep into that. How many chapters do you got left in the 90s?
I have one. It's Delta Green. I got to write about Delta Green next. That's why one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, so I can get my thoughts in order.
Well, there you go. You're going to hear more about Delta Green in Stu's book. So Stu is hard at work at his book. We got a behind the scenes look at the book. We've got a behind the scenes look at My RPG 321 Action and our coming soon. We are laying it out. We're going to get it to press. We're going to get it to the backers, and we're going to get it to everybody. Rocket to Russia. We've got a great look at that behind the scenes. We've also got early release episodes. We have a Discord community that is separate from our general Discord chat, where we'd love to chat with you as well. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.